The sun scorched the open prairie, and the wind carried the smell of dust, horses, and old gun oil. Heat shimmered across the cracked earth where a hawk turned lazy circles in the sky. A woman was tied to a fence post, wrists swollen and dry blood caked around the rope. Her name was Emily Moore. She hadn't had food or water for a day, her lips split and trembling. If you're watching this, subscribe and let me know where you're watching from. This story gets much more intense, and I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. The dress that once fit neat against her shape now hung in shreds. The fabric stuck to her skin with sweat and dirt. Every breath scraped her throat like sandpaper. She'd screamed herself hoarse hours ago. No one had come. Now, her voice was only a whisper carried by the wind, soft but raw. "Cut it loose, please." The words sounded desperate, cracked, almost like nonsense between gasps. She wasn't begging for shame. She was begging for mercy, for someone to end the pain that had almost eaten her alive. Miles away, a wagon creaked up a narrow trail. Jack Hayes, a man of 48 with a sunburned face and eyes like weathered steel, held the reins. His hat shaded the deep lines of a life spent losing too much: his land, his cattle, his pride. The cabin waiting ahead was meant to be a new start, a chance to breathe again. He'd bought it sight unseen from a man in town who had needed cash fast. Jack remembered the warning that came with the deal. "Careful, Hayes. Folks out there don't like strangers buying what isn't meant to be sold." He had laughed it off then, thinking it was just whiskey talk. But as the hills grew silent and the wind turned dry and mean, the memory stuck in his chest like a nail. Maybe this land wasn't as quiet as it looked. When Jack reached the cabin, the air wavered with heat. A thin stream of smoke curled from the chimney, too much to be old ash. Someone was here. He set his jaw, hand brushing the handle of his knife. Then he heard it, a faint cry from the fence line, human and weak. He jumped down, boots crunching dry soil. For a moment, he thought the sun was playing tricks on him, until he saw her. Emily hung against the post, the ropes biting deep, her body barely holding on. Jack's throat tightened. He cut the rope with a clean stroke. She fell forward, light as a ghost, right into his arms. Her hands clutched at her stomach, like she was protecting something precious he couldn't yet see. Her lips moved, barely a breath. "My baby, he has to live." Jack froze. Those words hit harder than the sun ever could. Somewhere in the back of his mind, his brother's voice echoed. "You don't walk past someone in trouble, Jack. Not ever." He couldn't leave her. Even when she tried to stand, her knees buckled. He caught her before she fell, saw the faint spark in her eyes, the kind that didn't die easy. Inside the cabin, he laid her down on the floor, poured a few drops of water on her lips, and covered her forehead with a damp cloth. Her skin burned under his fingers, her breath shallow and thin. Every time she stirred, she whispered something soft he couldn't quite catch. Jack sat beside her in silence, listening to the flies buzz beyond the window, wondering what kind of hell she had crawled from. When she finally opened her eyes, she looked at him, voice barely a whisper. "Thank you." He leaned closer. "Who did this to you?" Her gaze drifted toward the door, fear creeping back in her voice. "They'll find me," she murmured. "They always do." The words sent a chill through him, even under the burning sun. He didn't yet know who they were, only that peace wasn't what waited here after all. Morning light crept through the cracks in the cabin walls, cutting across the dust that hung in the air. The place smelled like wood smoke and dry coffee grounds. Emily stirred, her eyes fluttering open as the pain caught up with her again. For a moment, she looked lost, like she didn't remember where she was or how she got there. Then she saw Jack sitting by the table, hat off, his rough hands wrapped around a tin cup, waiting. He'd been there all night, watching, listening to make sure she kept breathing. When her eyes met his, he stood slowly, careful not to startle her. "You're safe," he said, voice low and steady. "No one's going to hurt you here." Her throat felt like sandpaper, but she managed a whisper. "Where am I?" "My land, or what's left of it," he said, pouring water into a small cup. "You were tied to my fence when I found you." She took the cup with trembling hands. The first sip hit her throat like mercy itself, and tears welled in her eyes before she could stop them. "Why'd you help me?" she asked, voice breaking halfway through the words. Jack shrugged, his gaze fixed on the window. Couldn't just ride by. Something in the way he said it made her believe him. She studied his face, the lines around his eyes, the tiredness that looked older than he was. "You bought this land alone?" she asked after a moment. "Yeah. Needed a place where the past couldn't follow." A faint, bitter smile crossed her lips. "Guess we both been running from ghosts." They sat in silence for a while, listening to the wind move through the dry grass outside. It wasn't awkward, just quiet, heavy, like the air itself was holding its breath. For the first time, Jack saw more than just a stranger he'd rescued. He saw a woman who'd been through something so cruel it had stolen the fear right out of her eyes. Finally, Emily spoke again, her voice small but sure. "They'll come back soon." Jack's hand froze on the rifle he was cleaning. "Who's they?" "Your folks." She shook her head, a shiver running through her shoulders. "No, men who don't stop until they get what they want." Jack followed her gaze through the window. At first, he saw nothing, just the wavering horizon and the shimmer of heat. But then his stomach tightened. A dust cloud, small but growing. Riders. He stood up, boots scraping the floor, and reached for the rifle hanging on the wall. The sound of the lever cocking broke the quiet like thunder. Emily's face went pale. "They found me," she whispered. Jack stepped to the window and peered out. 3 men on horseback moved in slow, confident formation. The one in front rode tall, his black coat rippling behind him like a storm about to break. "Who is he?" Jack asked. Her voice trembled. "His name's Marcus Vale. He's the man who did this to me." The name sank into Jack like a bullet. He'd heard it before, stories from town about a land baron who made people disappear if they stood in his way. And now that man was riding straight toward his door. He loaded each shell carefully, the sound of metal clicking against wood filling the room. "You stay put," he said firmly. Emily reached out, grabbing his sleeve with weak fingers. "You don't know what he's capable of." Jack met her eyes, calm, unflinching. "I've met his kind before." Outside, the horses stopped. Boots hit the ground. Voices echoed through the hot air. "Come on out, Hayes. We know you're in there." Jack's blood ran cold. They knew his name. He looked back at Emily, suspicion flickering in his eyes. "What did you tell him?" Her face went white. "I swear I didn't," she said, panic rising in her chest. "But he always finds out." Then came the knock. Heavy, slow. The sound rattled the cabin walls. "Emily," a man's voice boomed, deep and steady. "You've made me chase you long enough. Come on out now before someone gets hurt." Jack tightened his grip on the rifle. The air outside went still. "If you open that door," she whispered, her voice shaking, "you'll never close it again." The next knock made the floorboards quiver. Jack's jaw set. The heat outside was unbearable, but the chill that ran through the room was worse. The door burst open. Dust swirled as 3 men stepped in, their shadows long and heavy. And at the front stood Marcus Vale, eyes sharp, smile cruel, hand resting casually on his gun. "Well," he said with a smirk, "there's my runaway wife." Emily froze. The moment his voice filled the cabin, something inside her broke again. Her fingers clenched the blanket as if she could somehow hold herself together. Jack stepped in front of her without thinking, the rifle low but steady in his hands. "This is private land," he said, voice calm but cold. Marcus's smile spread wider, the kind that never reached the eyes. "Everything I touch is mine, cowboy." That includes her. Jack didn't flinch. He'd seen men like Marcus before, the kind who believed power was the same thing as ownership. He could feel Emily's trembling behind him, and that was enough to hold his ground. "She says she's not your wife," Jack said evenly. Marcus's jaw tightened, though his smile didn't fade. "The law says otherwise." One of his men, a lean, nervous-looking fellow with a scar running from temple to chin, moved a step closer, hand twitching near his pistol. Jack's finger brushed the trigger, warning him without a word. The air between them felt thick enough to choke on. Marcus took a slow step forward, his boots creaking against the old wooden floor. "You remind me of someone, Hayes," he said softly. "A rancher I met up north." stubborn. Thought land and honor were worth dying for. The words landed heavy, but the name that came next cut deeper. Samuel Hayes. Jack's stomach turned cold. Samuel, his brother. The one found dead on a lonely trail months ago. The one whose killer was never found. "What did you just say?" Jack asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. Marcus's smile twisted cruelly. "Guess your brother should have sold when he had the chance." The world shrank to the space between them. Jack's hand tightened around the rifle, his pulse pounding in his ears. "You killed him," he said quietly. Marcus shrugged. He made it easy. Jack's breath slowed. He set the rifle down on the table and reached for his revolver instead. Marcus lifted a hand, almost politely. "Now hold on," he said. "Let's not make a mess in front of the lady. We'll do this proper." He tossed his coat aside and stepped into the sunlight outside. "You and me. One draw, one chance. You win, I walk away. I win." His eyes cut toward Emily. "She comes home." Emily's voice cracked, desperate. "Jack, no. He'll kill you." Jack's gaze never left Marcus. "He already killed my brother." He stepped out into the blinding heat. The air trembled around them. The land was silent except for the creak of leather and the distant cry of a hawk. Marcus stood with a lazy confidence, one hand hovering over his holster, the other resting easy by his side. For Jack, everything slowed. He could hear his heart beating, steady as a drum. He could smell the gun oil, feel the weight of the revolver against his palm. Across from him, Marcus smiled, sure of himself, sure of victory. The world held its breath. 1, Marcus said softly. Jack's thumb brushed the hammer. 2, sweat ran down his temple, stinging his cut lip. They locked eyes. 2 men, 2 pasts, one line between life and death. 3, the flash came first, bright and brutal. The crack followed, sharp enough to split the air in half. Dust exploded from the ground. The echo rolled across the hills like thunder. When the smoke cleared, Marcus Vale was on the ground, his gun half drawn, his breath rattling out in short, broken gasps. Jack stood over him, chest heaving, the smell of gunpowder heavy in the still air. Emily ran from the cabin, tears streaking through the dirt on her face. "Jack!" He lowered the gun slowly, eyes never leaving the dying man at his feet. "It's over." But Marcus still managed a bitter smile, blood dark at the corner of his mouth. "You think this ends with me, Hayes?" he rasped. "You don't even know who owns this valley." Then his eyes went still. His body slumped, the last of his words carried away by the wind. Emily stood shaking, the rifle still in her hands. "The next shot," she whispered, voice trembling but fierce, "won't miss." Jack turned toward her, seeing not the fragile woman he'd found tied to a fence, but someone reborn from pain, someone who had learned how to fight to survive. For a long moment, the world stood still. Only the wind moved, curling around the two of them, the dying echo of gunfire fading into silence. The smell of dust and blood hung heavy. Jack's hands shook as he lowered his revolver, his heart still pounding from the fight that shouldn't have happened, but somehow always had to. Emily stepped closer, tears spilling down her cheeks, her breath uneven. "You didn't have to do that," she whispered. Jack looked at her, his eyes tired, voice rough. "I didn't have a choice." He turned toward the body in the dirt. Marcus Vale, the man who had destroyed so many lives, lying there like just another piece of earth. Jack had seen death before, but this one felt heavier. It wasn't victory. It was a reckoning that left no joy behind. Emily's knees gave out. She sat down in the doorway, the rifle slipping from her grasp. Her whole body trembled, but not from fear anymore, from release. From the years of running that had finally stopped. Jack walked over and crouched beside her. "You're safe now," he said softly. She shook her head, looking out toward the horizon. "No one's ever really safe. Not out here." Her voice cracked halfway through the sentence, and her hand went instinctively to her stomach. Jack noticed. "You hurt?" he asked quickly, worry cutting through his exhaustion. Emily hesitated, her fingers pressing lightly over her belly. Her lips parted, but no words came at first. Then, finally, she whispered, "I'm pregnant." Jack froze. The world seemed to shrink again, quiet enough to hear her heartbeat if he'd listened close enough. He opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came. She kept her gaze on the dirt. "It's not his," she said, almost like she was confessing to a ghost. "The man I loved died before he ever knew." Her voice cracked on the word loved. "When Marcus found out, he said the child would be his heir, whether I wanted it or not. I ran before he could take that too." Jack sat beside her, the creak of his boots the only sound for a moment. He didn't look at her right away. Instead, he stared at the horizon, the same sky he'd watched 100 times, trying to forget everything he'd lost. Now it all came rushing back. His brother, his land, his wife and son buried years ago. "Sometimes life takes everything from you," he said quietly, more to himself than to her. "But maybe it's trying to give something back after." Emily looked at him then, really looked. His hands were rough, his face worn from sun and time, but his eyes were steady, the kind that had seen too much and still hadn't given up. "Why are you helping me?" she asked. Jack smiled faintly. "Maybe because someone once helped me when I didn't deserve it." They sat in silence again, not as strangers anymore, but as two broken people who somehow found each other in the same storm. Then, from far down the trail, came the faint sound of horses, not the wild, hurried gallop of outlaws, but the steady, official rhythm of lawmen. Jack's eyes narrowed. "Company," he muttered. Emily's breath caught. She gripped his sleeve, her fingers trembling. "They'll never believe me. They'll think I killed him." Jack looked at her, then at the body lying in the dirt. He knew she was right. The law didn't always care about truth, only what looked clean on paper. And this wouldn't. The horses stopped just beyond the fence. Boots hit the ground. A voice called out, firm and tired. "Jack Hayes." Jack stood, hands still resting on his revolver, though not in threat, just habit. The sheriff's star gleamed in the fading sunlight as Sheriff Morrison stepped forward, his eyes taking in everything. The gun, the woman, the dead man on the ground. "That's Marcus Vale, ain't it?" he said quietly. His tone carried more weight than surprise. He'd known this man, maybe feared him, maybe hated him too. Emily didn't speak. Her hands were shaking again, her face pale. Morrison's deputy pointed toward her. "Sheriff." I saw her holding the rifle. The world seemed to tilt for a second. Jack stepped forward, his voice steady but urgent. "She didn't shoot him." "I did." Morrison's eyes narrowed. "You a drifter, Hayes, or one of his hired guns?" Jack reached into his vest and pulled out a small silver watch, old, scratched, and worn from years of use. He held it out. "This belonged to my brother, Samuel Hayes. Marcus killed him. Look inside." The sheriff hesitated, then opened the watch. Inside was a folded map and an engraving. "To Samuel, keep fighting the good fight." Morrison's face changed. His tone softened. "You're Samuel's brother?" Jack nodded once. "I am." Morrison looked from the watch to the map, then to Emily's bruised wrists and torn dress. The pieces were falling into place, the truth too heavy to ignore. He took a deep breath. "All right, Hayes, I'll hear you out." Emily exhaled for the first time in what felt like days. For a brief moment, hope flickered again. But deep down, she knew the road ahead wasn't over. It was only changing shape. Because out here, justice didn't come easy. It came with a cost. The sun began to sink, spilling gold across the dry land. The bodies, the fear, the silence. Everything felt unreal. Emily stood by the doorway, one hand resting on her belly, the other clutching the frame like it was the only thing keeping her upright. The sheriff's men spread out around the yard, quiet and cautious. Sheriff Morrison crouched beside Marcus Vale's body, the dust rising around him. His voice came low, thoughtful. "Never thought I'd see this man dead," he muttered. Half the town was too scared to even say his name. Jack watched from the porch, arms crossed, trying to read the sheriff's face. He wasn't sure if this man was here to bring truth or trouble. Emily spoke, her voice barely carrying over the dry wind. "He found me months ago, said I belonged to him, but I never did." Morrison looked up at her, something almost gentle in his eyes. "I can see that." He stood, brushing dust from his hands. "But you'll have to tell me everything." Jack stepped closer. "I'll tell you too," he said quietly. She didn't kill him. I did. The sheriff's eyes moved to him. Then let's start there. They sat inside the cabin. The air was heavy with smoke and sweat. Morrison's notebook lay open on the table, the pages fluttering from the faint breeze sneaking through the cracks. He listened, really listened, as they told him everything. Emily spoke in short breaths, her voice breaking more than once. She told of the nights Marcus kept her locked away, the threats, the beatings, the moment she ran when she found out she was carrying another man's child. Her hands trembled when she spoke the baby's name, a name she'd whispered to herself every night just to stay alive. Jack filled in the rest. The fence, the rescue, the gunfight. He didn't make himself the hero. He just told it plain, like truth should sound. When it was over, Morrison looked at them both, long and quiet. There's more to this, he said finally. He reached in his coat and pulled out the folded map from the watch. Your brother, he'd been working with me before he died. Said there were men stealing land all across this valley. I reckon Marcus was at the center of it. Jack's breath caught. You're telling me my brother was killed for trying to stop this? Morrison nodded. Looks that way. He tapped the map with a finger. If we follow this, we'll find what Samuel found, proof. Maybe even justice. For the first time in a long while, Jack felt something shift inside him. Not peace, not yet, but purpose. 3 days later, the sheriff's men uncovered a hidden cave in the hills north of the cabin. Inside were boxes of papers, stolen land deeds, forged signatures, and letters signed by Marcus Vale himself. When Morrison returned, the look in his eyes said everything. You were right, he told Jack. Your brother died trying to stop him, but he didn't die for nothing. The court cleared Emily's name, every word backed by the papers found in that cave. She wasn't a fugitive anymore. She was a survivor. The trial ended quietly, but the world felt different when it was done. The valley that once belonged to a cruel man now belonged to the people who'd suffered under him. Jack rebuilt the cabin from the ground up. New boards, new roof, same land, but new start. The scars stayed, but they no longer defined him. One crisp morning, as dawn broke over the hills, Emily stood outside hanging a white sheet on the line. The wind caught it, the cloth snapping bright in the sunlight. She smiled, feeling life inside her move. Jack stepped onto the porch, coffee steaming in his hands. You okay? He asked softly. She turned, eyes bright. The baby kicked, she said, her voice warm with quiet joy. Jack smiled, the first real smile he'd felt in years. You pick a name yet? She touched her belly gently. If it's a boy, Samuel. For the man who made all this possible. Jack looked out at the horizon, where the sun met the land, and the land met everything they'd lost and found again. His throat tightened. He'd like that, he said. The wind blew steady and kind, carrying the smell of coffee, earth, and something like peace. Sometimes, Jack thought, life takes everything from you so it can teach you what really matters. Sometimes the road to peace runs through fire. And sometimes the people who arrive at your door, bruised, broken, and scared, end up saving you just as much as you save them. He looked at Emily, then at the bright morning sky. Guess this old land was worth something after all, he murmured. She smiled, wiping a tear before it could fall. Yeah, she said. It gave us a reason to live again. The past was still there, buried but not forgotten. But for the first time, neither of them was running anymore. And maybe that was the real kind of freedom. Winter came quiet that year. The valley, once scarred by fire and gun smoke, turned soft under pale skies and thin morning frost. The air carried the scent of pine and the faraway echo of wolves. Jack split wood behind the cabin, his breath turning white in the cold. Every swing of the axe felt honest. Work that didn't demand words, only rhythm. Inside, Emily sat near the hearth, mending one of Jack's shirts by hand. Her belly had grown round, full with the new life that was coming soon. Each time the baby kicked, she stopped sewing for a second and smiled to herself. Not the shy, uncertain smile she used to hide behind, but a real one. One that reached her eyes. Jack came in, brushing snow from his shoulders. Cold's biting hard this morning, he said, warming his hands by the fire. She looked up from the sewing, her tone teasing but gentle. You say that every morning. He grinned, the lines near his eyes softening. And every morning it's true. For a while, they just sat there, the crackle of the fire filling the quiet between them. It wasn't an awkward silence. It was peace, a kind they'd both forgotten could exist. After a moment, Emily said quietly, "Sometimes I think about what would have happened if you hadn't come that day." Jack didn't answer right away. He stared into the fire, watching the wood collapse into glowing coals. "Don't," he said finally. "Some things ain't worth imagining." Her hand rested over her stomach. "I think I was meant to find this place," she whispered. "Meant to find you." Jack turned toward her then, eyes steady, voice low. "You saved me too, Emily. You just don't see it yet." Her eyes glistened, but she smiled through it. "You really believe that?" He nodded slowly. "I was ready to die out here. Lost everything that mattered. But then you came along, and suddenly the silence didn't feel so heavy." The baby kicked again. Emily laughed softly, her hand pressing against the movement. "He likes your voice." Jack chuckled. "Then he's already got poor taste." They both laughed, a quiet sound, almost shy but real. For the first time in a long time, it didn't feel like the world was punishing them for being alive. A few weeks later, the baby came in the middle of the night, when the snow had stopped and the stars burned clear. Jack had helped deliver calves before, but never a child. His hands shook so badly he could hardly hold the blanket steady. Emily's cries filled the cabin. Pain, strength, life. And when it was over, the sound that replaced them was small and perfect. Jack looked down at the baby boy in his arms, red-faced and loud as thunder, and something in him broke open. All the years of bitterness and guilt fell away. Emily reached out, her face pale but glowing with tears. "He's beautiful," she whispered. Jack swallowed hard. "You did good," he said, voice rough. "You both did." She smiled faintly. "Samuel," she said. "That's his name." Jack nodded, eyes misty. "Samuel it is." The days after were simple, the kind of quiet that stays after a storm passes. Jack worked the land again, slowly turning the hard earth back into something that could grow. Emily cared for the baby, singing to him when the nights got cold. Sometimes Jack would wake before dawn just to listen, her soft voice, the baby's breathing, the crackle of the dying fire. He'd stand by the window and look out at the valley, remembering everything that had happened. The pain, the loss, the gunfire, the ghosts. And every time, he thought the same thing. It was all worth it. One morning, as spring began to melt the snow, Emily came up behind him and slipped her hand into his. "You thinking again?" she asked, smiling. "Always," he said softly. She leaned her head against his shoulder. "Then think about this. We made it." Jack squeezed her hand gently. "Yeah," he said. "We did." Outside, the world was waking up again. The grass pushing through thawed soil, the air sweet with the promise of something new. And for the first time in years, Jack didn't feel like a man haunted by the past. He felt like someone building a future. The years that followed weren't easy, but they were honest. That was enough. The land slowly came back to life, the same way people do when they stop running from their ghosts. The valley that once echoed with gunfire now carried the sound of a hammer on wood, a plow in the dirt, a baby's laughter rolling through the wind. Samuel, the little boy with his mother's calm eyes and Jack's stubborn will, learned to walk on the same soil where his father once fought for survival. He stumbled through the dirt, giggling, chasing chickens that always seemed faster than he was. Jack built him a wooden horse one winter, carving it from an old fence post. He spent nights by the fire, sanding its edges smooth. Emily would watch from her chair, rocking Samuel in her arms, smiling at the man who had once been too afraid to hope for anything more than survival. One evening, as the sun bled orange over the hills, Emily set the table for three. The cabin smelled of stew, the kind that took all day to make. Jack came in from the barn, wiping his hands on his jeans. "Smells like heaven," he said. "It's just beans and whatever you managed to shoot," she teased. He laughed. "Then it's the best thing I've had all week." Samuel was on the floor, banging a wooden spoon against a pot, making music only he understood. Jack bent down, ruffled his hair, and for a moment, the world outside didn't exist. No pain, no violence, just family. After dinner, when Samuel had fallen asleep, Emily sat beside the fire, the glow dancing against her face. Jack poured them each a small cup of coffee. They didn't talk at first. They didn't need to. The silence between them wasn't empty anymore. It was full of everything they didn't have to say. After a while, Emily broke the quiet. "You ever think about leaving this place?" she asked. Jack looked around at the wooden walls he'd rebuilt, the coat rack he'd made, the little shoes by the door. He shook his head. "I used to think peace meant moving on. Now I think it means staying put." She smiled faintly. "You're not the same man I met." He stared into the fire. "Neither are you." Outside, the night wind howled across the prairie. Jack stood, walked to the window, and stared into the dark. "Sometimes I still see him," he said quietly. Emily looked up. "Marcus." He nodded. "In dreams mostly. Standing in the dust. Same smile, same eyes. I wake up ready to fight again." She walked to him and took his hand. "Then you remind yourself that you already won." He turned to her, and something in his chest loosened. For years, he'd carried guilt like a second skin. But standing there with her hand in his, it didn't feel like punishment anymore. It felt like proof. Proof that even broken people could build something worth keeping. The next morning, they rode into town for the first time in months. The townsfolk stared when they arrived, not with fear or gossip this time, but with respect. The story of Marcus Vale's fall had spread far and wide. People whispered that justice had finally returned to the valley. The blacksmith waved as they passed. The store clerk offered Emily a basket of apples for the boy. Jack felt a weight lift he didn't even know he still carried. They spent the day trading supplies, picking up seed, and listening to laughter instead of threats. By the time they rode home, the sun was setting behind the ridge, and the sky glowed like fire turned gentle. Emily leaned against him as the horse trotted steady beneath them. "You ever wonder what your brother would think of all this?" she asked softly. Jack smiled. "I think he'd say, I finally stopped running." The road back to the cabin was long and quiet, just the sound of hooves and wind. But it didn't feel lonely anymore. It felt like home. And when they reached the cabin, Jack looked out at the land, the same land that had taken so much from him, and realized something he hadn't before. He hadn't bought this place to escape the past. He'd bought it to build a future. Spring returned again, slow, gentle, and kind this time. The valley that had once known blood and grief now bloomed with wildflowers. The river ran full from the mountain melt, and the hills were alive with green. It was as if the land itself had decided to forgive. Jack stood on the porch with a mug of coffee, watching Samuel chase a butterfly through the grass. The boys' laughter carried all the way to the fence line, bright, wild, free. Emily was nearby, hanging clothes on the line, humming softly. The wind caught her hair, and for a second, Jack just watched her, amazed at how someone could go through so much pain and still smile like that. He never said it out loud, but she had saved him, not with grand gestures or words, but with quiet strength, with the way she kept moving forward, even when the world had tried to break her. When she noticed him watching, she smiled. "What's on your mind, cowboy?" He grinned faintly. "Just thinking how lucky I got." She walked up the steps and stood beside him, her hand brushing his arm. "You call this lucky?" she said, half teasing, half serious. Jack took a slow breath, eyes on the horizon. "Yeah," he said softly. "Lucky that the worst days led me here." They stood like that for a long time, watching Samuel run through the tall grass, the sunlight catching in his hair. There was no sound of horses chasing, no fear of footsteps at the door, just the easy rhythm of a life rebuilt. Later that night, after Samuel had fallen asleep, Emily and Jack sat by the fire. The baby's soft breathing filled the silence. "You ever wonder why things happened the way they did?" she asked quietly. Jack thought about it. The rope on the fence, the gunfight, the graves left behind, the long days of rebuilding. "Yeah," he said, "but I think sometimes life tears you apart just to show you what you're made of. You either stay broken, or you learn how to put yourself back together." Emily looked into the fire, her eyes shining. "Maybe we didn't find peace," she said. "Maybe we built it." Jack smiled, reaching over to take her hand. Either way, we earned it. The fire popped softly, and the glow wrapped around them like a blanket. Outside, the wind brushed through the grass, carrying the scent of rain and cedar. In that quiet, Jack finally understood what his brother used to tell him. That courage wasn't about standing tall with a gun in your hand. It was about standing firm when life tried to knock you down. About choosing kindness when anger was easier. About finding something worth protecting and doing it without expecting anything in return. As the night deepened, Jack whispered more to himself than to her. You know, sometimes the hardest battles ain't out there. He nodded toward the window, where the land stretched endless under the moon. They're the ones we fight inside. Emily leaned her head on his shoulder, closing her eyes. Then maybe that's what makes us human, she said softly. Jack smiled. Maybe it is. The flames flickered low, and for the first time in years, the silence felt like peace, not loneliness. Outside, the wind carried the sound of a child's laughter, a promise that the valley would never be quiet the same way again. And maybe that was the lesson life had been trying to teach them all along. That pain doesn't end you. It shapes you. That love doesn't erase the past. It gives it meaning. And that even after fire, the land can still grow flowers.